I bought the Lighthouse for $11,000 from a county auction website while sitting in a dermatologist's waiting room. The listing described it as decommissioned maritime structure, significant structural concerns, sold as is. The photograph showed a white tower with peeling paint standing on a granite headland, surrounded by dead grass and rusted chain-link fencing. Something about it called to me the way certain mistakes do, quietly, dressed up as opportunity. My name is Emmett Kavanaugh, and I was 34 years old when I decided to leave behind a career in municipal engineering that had given me nothing but a reliable paycheck and a slow erosion of purpose. I had spent 12 years designing drainage systems and reviewing load-bearing specifications for buildings I would never enter again. My wife, Renee, had left 14 months prior. She took the dog, the good couch, and any remaining illusion that I was someone capable of making bold decisions. The Lighthouse was my answer to that accusation. I was going to restore it. I was going to live in it. I was going to become the kind of man who lives in a lighthouse. The property sat on Cairn Point, a rocky promontory jutting into the Atlantic about 6 miles north of a town called Harker's Bluff, population 900. The nearest neighbor was a lobster fisherman named Dale Odom, who lived in a salt box house a mile down the coastal road. Dale was 67, shaped like a rain barrel, and had the conversational warmth of a crowbar. The first time I met him, he looked at my rental car, looked at me, and said, "You the one who bought that death trap?" I told him I was. He nodded and walked away. That was the entire interaction. The lighthouse itself was a 46-foot cast iron and brick tower built in 1891 and decommissioned in 1987. The attached keeper's cottage was a 2-story structure with a pitched roof that had partially collapsed on the eastern side. Inside, I found water damage, rodent nests, shattered glass, and a smell that existed somewhere between mildew and regret. The lantern room at the top still held its original Fresnel lens, clouded and cracked but intact. Standing up there on my first day, looking out at the gray Atlantic churning against the rocks below, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a story that hadn't been written yet. I started renovations in March. I replaced the roof on the cottage first, working from YouTube tutorials and a structural engineering instinct that hadn't fully atrophied. I repointed the mortar on the tower. I installed a composting toilet, a rainwater collection system, and a propane generator I bought from an estate sale. I ran electrical conduit up the interior of the tower and mounted LED floods in the lantern room so I could work at night. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't beautiful, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I slept without pharmaceutical assistance. The news was background noise during those weeks. I caught fragments on the truck radio during supply runs to Harker's Bluff. Reports of a respiratory illness in Southeast Asia, quarantine zones in 3 provinces, the World Health Organization issuing cautious language that everyone interpreted as controlled panic. I didn't pay attention. I was measuring lumber and mixing concrete and teaching myself to solder copper pipe. The world had been ending in slow motion my entire adult life. Financial collapses, pandemics, political disintegration. I had stopped flinching at headlines years ago. Then, one evening in late April, I drove into Harker's Bluff for a hardware run and found the gas station closed. Not out of business closed, abandoned closed. The pumps were still on. The open sign still flickered in the window. But the door was ajar, and the register was open, and there was a handprint on the glass that was the wrong color. It was dark, almost black, and it had been made by fingers that had dragged downward, as if the person pressing against the glass had lost the ability to stand. I stared at it for a long time. Then I filled my gas cans, left $40 on the counter, and drove back to the lighthouse without stopping. The next morning, I found Dale Odom standing at the base of my tower with a bolt-action rifle slung over his shoulder and a look on his face I'd never seen from him before. He looked uncertain. On a man built from granite and routine, uncertainty was terrifying. "You got a radio in there?" he asked. I told him I had a weather band receiver. He shook his head. "You need a real one. Shortwave. Something with reach." He shifted his weight, glanced back toward the road. "Telephone lines went down last night. Cell towers, too. My satellite dish is pulling static on every channel except one, and that one's been playing the same emergency broadcast on a loop since 2 in the morning. I invited him inside. He looked at my renovation work. The reinforced door frame, the new steel deadbolts, the repaired staircase spiraling up through the tower. And for the first time since I'd known him, he offered something that resembled approval. "You've done real work here," he said. "That's going to matter." Over instant coffee that tasted like rust and ambition, Dale told me what he knew. 3 days earlier, a fishing boat had drifted into the harbor at Harker's Bluff with no one at the helm. The harbor master, a woman named Colleen Sharp, had boarded it and found the crew below deck. They were not dead. They were also not, in any recognizable sense, alive. She had radioed the Coast Guard. No one responded. She had called the county sheriff. The line rang until it disconnected. By the following morning, Colleen herself had stopped answering her radio. "I drove into town yesterday," Dale said. Main Street was empty except for Margaret Pruitt's van parked sideways across the road with both doors open. I saw someone standing in the alley beside the hardware store. Just standing, facing the wall. Not moving. I called out and they turned around and He stopped. He picked up his coffee and put it down without drinking. "I've cleaned fish my whole life. I've gutted deer and dressed out every animal you can name. I've never seen a human face look like that. The jaw was wrong. The eyes were there, but they weren't tracking anything. It started walking toward me, and the sound it made wasn't a voice. It was air being forced through a throat that had forgotten what speech was. He had driven home, locked his doors, loaded every weapon he owned, and spent the night watching the road through his kitchen window. Nothing came. But he heard sounds from the woods behind his house, branches breaking, something dragging through undergrowth, that continued until dawn. "I think we're past the point where this gets explained on the news," he said. I sat with that statement for a long time. The engineer in me wanted data. I wanted infection rates and transmission vectors and a timeline that made bureaucratic sense. But the part of me that had bought a ruined lighthouse on impulse, that had always trusted instinct over analysis at the moments that mattered most, understood what Dale was telling me. Whatever was happening had already outrun the infrastructure designed to contain it. We were in the aftermath of something that hadn't finished arriving. I asked Dale what he wanted to do. He looked around the lighthouse cottage, at the thick stone walls, the reinforced entrance, the tower rising overhead with its panoramic view of the coastline and the single access road. "I think," he said slowly, "you accidentally built the only defensible position for 20 miles. That afternoon, we made a list. We inventoried my supplies. 14 days of canned food, 60 gallons of collected rainwater, propane for roughly a month, basic tools, my renovation materials." Dale went home and returned 2 hours later with his truck loaded. More food, ammunition, fishing gear, marine batteries, a shortwave radio from the 1980s that he swore still worked, and a first aid kit that looked older than I was. We didn't talk about how long we were preparing for. We didn't acknowledge that the preparations themselves were an admission. We just worked, and the silence between tasks felt like the shared language of people who understand that the conversation they need to have is too large to begin. The short wave came to life that evening with the reluctant crackle of a machine that resented being asked to perform after decades of retirement. Dale sat at the table, with the patience of a man who had tuned radio since before I was born, moving through frequencies with small, deliberate adjustments. Static, a ghost of music. Someone's automated station, still broadcasting jazz into the void. More static. Then, at 7.245 megahertz, a voice. It was a woman, mid-30s by the sound of it, broadcasting from what she called Relay Station Victor, somewhere in New Hampshire. Her name was Lynn. She spoke in the clipped, organized cadence of someone with military or medical training. She was reading a list. The infection had been designated NRV7 by the CDC before the CDC went dark. Neurological restructuring virus. Transmission was fluid contact, an aerosol at close range. Incubation ranged from 4 hours to 3 days, depending on exposure method. The infected did not die. Their autonomic systems continued to function. Heartbeat, respiration, digestion. But higher cognitive architecture collapsed in stages. Language went first, then recognition, then self-preservation instinct. What remained was motor function, driven by something the early researchers had called predatory territorial response. The infected did not hunt. They occupied spaces and responded with violence to the presence of the uninfected. They were drawn to sound, to light, and to the thermal signatures of living bodies. They did not sleep. Lynn's broadcast repeated every 90 minutes. Between repetitions, she took shortwave calls. We listened to 4 of them. A family in Vermont barricaded in a school gymnasium. A man on a sailboat off the Maine coast who hadn't been ashore in a week and wanted to know if it was safe to land. 2 teenagers broadcasting from a cell tower maintenance shed in Massachusetts who kept cutting out mid-sentence. Lynn answered each one with the same steady voice, the same practical guidance, the same sign-off. Stay fortified, stay quiet, stay human. I asked Dale what he thought stay human meant. He said he figured we'd find out. By the 3rd day, we had transformed the Lighthouse into something that bore little resemblance to the renovation project I'd begun weeks earlier. The cottage entrance was barricaded with stacked lumber and steel sheeting bolted to the frame. I had sealed every ground floor window with plywood backed by concrete board. The only access point was a reinforced door with a drop bar I'd fashioned from a steel I-beam offcut. The tower itself became our watchtower, our signal station, our last retreat. The spiral staircase was narrow enough that a single person could defend it from above. The lantern room gave 360 degrees of visibility across open terrain. Ocean to the east, the coastal road to the south, sparse forest and granite outcroppings to the west and north. Dale mounted his rifle scope to a makeshift bipod at the lantern room railing and spent an hour each morning scanning the road and tree line. I focused on sustainability, expanding the rainwater system, building a gravity-fed filtration setup, establishing a small fishing operation from the rocks below the point. We fell into rhythm quickly. 2 men who understood that efficiency of labor was its own form of communication. On the 4th morning, I saw them for the first time through the scope. 3 figures on the road, approximately half a mile south. They moved with the stuttering gait Lynn had described. Functional locomotion stripped of coordination, like marionettes operated by someone who understood the mechanics of walking, but not its purpose. One of them was wearing a postal uniform. Another was barefoot. They moved north along the road, stopped at seemingly random intervals, stood motionless for minutes at a time, then continued. They did not approach the lighthouse. They seemed unaware of it. But watching them through magnified glass, tracking their alien movement patterns against the familiar landscape of the road I had driven dozens of times, something shifted in my understanding. These were not sick people. Whatever they had been was over. The bodies remained, but the tenants had been evicted. What occupied them now operated on principles I did not yet understand, and wasn't sure I wanted to. Dale came up behind me and watched without speaking. Then he went downstairs, and I heard him checking the locks. On the 6th day, the lighthouse received its first refugees, and I learned something about myself I hadn't known. That my capacity for suspicion had grown a root system during the years I wasn't paying attention. They arrived on foot from the south, visible on the road for 20 minutes before they reached the point. 2 women and a boy. I watched through the scope as they walked, checking behind them with the nervous regularity of prey animals. The older woman carried a backpack and a tire iron. The younger one held the boy's hand with a grip that hadn't relaxed in days by the look of her whitened knuckles. Dale identified them before they reached the fence. That's Sarah Keene, runs the bookshop in Harker's Bluff. And that's her sister, I think. Younger one. Don't know the kid. Sarah Keene was 41, had close-cropped silver hair and the permanent sunburn of a coastal New Englander, and possessed a directness of speech that immediately reminded me of Renee. Her sister Margot was 28 and visibly pregnant. Not dramatically so, but enough that the reality of it settled over our calculations like a second gravity. The boy was Margot's son, Theo, age 7. He had not spoken since they left Harker's Bluff. I let them in. Dale didn't object, but I noticed him note the cost. 3 additional mouths against a food supply calibrated for 2. He was not cruel. He was arithmetic. In survival, I would learn, the distance between those 2 things narrows until it becomes difficult to see the gap. Sarah told us what had happened in town. The infection had moved through Harker's Bluff in 48 hours. It started with the fishing crew. Colleen Sharp turned next. Then 3 people who had been at the harbor that morning. Then others, in a pattern that followed social contact like a lit fuse following a branching wire. By the 2nd day, the infected outnumbered the uninfected. By the 3rd day, the distinction became academic because everyone who remained uninfected had either fled or hidden. Sarah and Margot had barricaded themselves in the bookshop's back room. They stayed silent for 2 days, listening to footsteps above them, to the sound of bodies colliding with shelves. On the 2nd night, the infected who had been inside the bookshop simply left. Sarah didn't know why. They walked out the front door. She heard the bell ring as they pushed through it, a sound so absurdly normal in that context that it nearly broke her, and moved off down the street. She waited 3 more hours, then gathered Margot and Theo and headed north because she remembered someone was working on the old lighthouse. "I didn't know if you'd still be here," she said. "I didn't know if you'd let us in." I understood the second statement as the more vulnerable admission. We reorganized. I gave Sarah and Margot the cottage's ground floor room that I'd been using as a bedroom. Theo slept on a cot beside his mother. Dale and I moved to bedrolls on the 2nd floor, taking shifts on watch. The food situation was manageable but not comfortable. I revised my calculations. At current consumption, we had 9 days of full rations, 14 if we reduced to subsistence level. Theo was the variable I hadn't accounted for. Not logistically, A 7-year-old eats less than an adult, and he showed no interest in food beyond what was placed directly in front of him. It was his silence that recalibrated the environment. He watched everything with enormous brown eyes and said nothing. He didn't cry. He didn't play. He sat wherever his mother placed him and observed the adults around him with an attention that felt decades older than his body. Margot explained quietly, while Theo was sleeping, that he had seen their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, standing in her garden, making a sound that Margot described as mechanical screaming, before she collapsed and began moving differently. Theo had watched through a window. He had not spoken since. I wanted to tell Margot he would recover. I wanted to offer the kind of reassurance that costs nothing and means less. But I was learning that the architecture of comfort requires foundations I no longer possessed. So I said nothing. And Margot seemed to understand the honesty of that silence. The fishing operation became our lifeline. I had identified a sheltered cove at the base of the headland, accessible by a narrow path cut into the granite. Each morning at dawn, before the light was strong enough to make our movement visible at distance, I descended with a hand line and a bucket, and spent 2 hours pulling in whatever the Atlantic offered. Pollock mostly, some mackerel, once a small striped bass that felt like a holiday. Dale taught me to smoke the excess over a low fire built inside a steel drum positioned on the seaward side of the lighthouse, where the wind carried the smoke out over the ocean rather than inland. It was during these early morning sessions at the cove that I had the space to process what was happening. The physical labor of fishing, the repetitive casting, the patient waiting, the hand-over-hand pull, created a rhythm against which my thoughts could organize themselves. I was not a survivalist. I had never prepared for collapse. I was an engineer who had bought a lighthouse because his marriage had ended, and he needed a project large enough to fill the space where a shared life had been. That I had inadvertently built something defensible was not foresight. It was luck in structural disguise. On the 8th day, the shortwave brought new information that restructured our understanding. Lynn's broadcast had been updated. Research teams, she didn't specify where, only that they existed, had observed behavioral evolution in the infected. Early-stage infected were territorial and reactive. But after approximately 2 weeks, a subset began exhibiting coordinated movement. Groups of 8 to 12 moving together, responding to stimuli collectively rather than individually. Lynn called them clusters. She said they appeared to communicate through subsonic vocalizations, sounds below the threshold of human hearing that could be detected with the right equipment. The clusters were more dangerous than individual infected for a simple reason. They could problem solve. Dale set down his coffee when Lynn said that. He looked at me with an expression I interpreted as the moment a tactician realizes the rules of engagement have expanded beyond his doctrine. Problem solve how? He asked, as if Lynn could hear him. Her next sentence answered. Clusters had been observed testing barriers, pushing against doors in alternating patterns, circling structures, returning to locations they had previously abandoned. One report described a cluster that had stacked debris against a wall to reach a second-story window. The implication was staggering. The virus wasn't just destroying cognitive function. After the initial collapse, it was rebuilding something in its place. Not human intelligence, something else, something organized around different priorities. Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, asked the question none of us had articulated. Are they getting smarter? I didn't answer because I didn't have one. Dale didn't answer because he was already climbing the stairs to the lantern room to scan the tree line with new eyes. What I did that afternoon was engineering. It was the only response I had to fear that didn't curdle into paralysis. I reinforced the barricade on the cottage door with additional cross-bracing. I welded angle iron across the sealed windows. I built a series of noise traps along the access road. Tripwires connected to cans filled with gravel that would alert us to approach without producing enough sound to attract attention from farther away. I constructed a secondary barrier at the base of the tower staircase, a heavy wooden gate that could be dropped and bolted from above if the cottage was breached. Theo watched me work. He stood at a careful distance, tracking each action with his silent attention. At one point, I needed someone to hold a piece of angle iron while I drilled through it, and without thinking, I looked at him and held it out. He stepped forward, took the iron in both hands, and braced it with surprising steadiness. I drilled the hole. He handed the piece back and returned to his observation post. It was the first interaction anyone had gotten from him that wasn't purely passive. Margot, watching from across the room, pressed her hand to her mouth and turned away. I pretended not to notice, which was its own form of grace. Between strangers learning to share a siege. The morning of the 10th day brought a development that fractured the fragile equilibrium we had established. I was in the lantern room on first watch when I spotted movement at the southern edge of the tree line. Not the stuttering gait of infected, not the cautious approach of refugees. This was deliberate, tactical movement. Figures advancing from cover to cover, pausing, scanning, then moving again. There were 5 of them. 3 men and 2 women, all carrying weapons. Not improvised weapons, actual firearms. They reached the access road and stopped at my gravel can perimeter. One of them knelt, examined the tripwire, and disarmed it with a practiced hand. Then they continued toward the lighthouse. I woke Dale. He came up the stairs with his rifle and assessed the approaching group through the scope. "Military bearing," he said. "At least 2 of them. The others are following their lead." We met them at the barricade. The man in front was tall, late 40s, with a shaved head and the kind of physical composure that comes from decades of institutional discipline. He introduced himself as Wes Harmon, retired Army, and said they had been monitoring our shortwave activity. He gestured to a woman behind him carrying a directional antenna unit. They had triangulated our position from our receiver's oscillator leakage, a technical detail that told me Wes's group had signals intelligence capability, which meant they had been something more specific than generic military. "We're not here to take anything," Wes said, reading the calculation on my face. "We're here because that tower is the best tactical position on this coastline. And what's coming from the south is going to make everything you've seen so far look like a rehearsal." His companions were Nina Voss, the signals specialist, late 30s with watchful eyes and a jaw set at a permanent angle of assessment. Garrett Lund, early 20s, former National Guard, carrying an M4 with the ease of someone who had slept beside one. And 2 civilians, Paul and Dina Marsh, a married couple from Harker's Bluff who had connected with Wes's group 2 days prior. Paul Marsh was the town's pharmacist. Dina had been the school secretary. They looked like what they were, ordinary people carrying a weight their lives had never prepared them to bear. Dina's left arm was wrapped in a makeshift bandage. She saw me notice and said, "Cut it on a fence, not a bite. I'll show you if you need to see." The fact that she anticipated the question told me she had already been asked to prove it elsewhere and that the asking had not been gentle. I looked at Dale. Dale looked at me. We had a conversation in 3 seconds of eye contact that covered territory, authority, resource allocation, and the fundamental question of whether we were building a community or defending a position. They are not the same project. A defensive position requires control. A community requires trust. In that moment, standing at the barricade with Wes Harmon's measured patience on one side and Dale's arithmetic pragmatism on the other, I chose to pursue both and accepted that the contradiction would eventually demand resolution. We let them in. The dynamics shifted immediately. Wes didn't demand authority, but his competence created its own gravitational field. Within an hour, he had assessed our defenses, identified 3 vulnerabilities I had missed, and proposed modifications that were unambiguously superior to my design. He was not arrogant. He was simply operating from a depth of tactical knowledge that made my engineering instincts look like finger painting beside architecture. I watched Sarah's reaction to this shift. She had adapted to the Lighthouse's original hierarchy. Dale and I as co-administrators, herself as a practical intermediary, Margot as a protected dependent. Wes's arrival rearranged these positions without any explicit conversation. Sarah recognized this and didn't resist it. But I saw her cataloging the change, filing it in whatever strategic framework she used to navigate the world. Sarah, I was beginning to understand, was not merely a bookshop owner. She was an observer of systems who happened to sell novels. That night, Wes briefed us on what was coming from the south, and the architecture of my confidence quietly rearranged itself around a new foundation of dread. Wes unfolded a roadmap on the cottage table and placed a flashlight at its center. The rest of us gathered around it the way ancient peoples must have gathered around fire, drawn by the promise that someone was about to explain the shape of the danger. The outbreak epicenter for this region was Portland, he said. The infection moved through the city in 6 days. Population 68,000, minus whoever got out early, which based on traffic patterns we observed was maybe 15%. That leaves roughly 58,000 infected within the metropolitan boundary. He tapped the map south of our position. They don't stay contained. The clusters Lynn described are real, and they're exhibiting migratory behavior. They move along infrastructure corridors, highways, rail lines, coastal roads. They follow the paths humans built because those paths are flat, unobstructed, and lead to population centers. He traced a line up the coast, Route 1 to Route 1A, threading through a dozen small towns, each one a node of potential additional infected. The line terminated at Harker's Bluff, and then, 6 miles further, at Cairn Point, at us. They aren't coming because they know we're here, Wes clarified. They're coming because the road comes here. We're at the end of a funnel. Nina added technical detail. The clusters she had observed through her equipment were broadcasting those subsonic signals Lynn had described. She had recorded them. The frequency patterns suggested rudimentary information transfer, direction, density, something that might correlate to threat assessment. She played a recording through a small speaker. We heard nothing. Then she slowed it down and pitched it into audible range, and a sound filled the room that made the hair on my arms stand, and Theo press his face into Margot's side. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, like a heartbeat processed through damaged machinery. But within the rhythm were variations, stutters, pitch changes, sequences that repeated and evolved. It sounded, horribly, like something trying to learn a language from the ground up. Not human language, something older, something that predated grammar and operated on a frequency we had forgotten how to hear. How long before they reach us? Dale asked. Based on observed movement rates, 3 to 5 days for the leading edge. The main body, maybe a week behind that. Sarah leaned forward. How many in the main body? Wes held her gaze. Our best estimate is between 8 and 12,000. The number sat in the room like a physical object, displacing air. I felt it press against my lungs. 8 to 12,000 bodies, moving along the coastal road, converging on the peninsula where I had built my fragile monument to starting over. The mathematics of it were annihilating. Every reinforcement I had made, every steel bracket and concrete board and welded angle iron, was designed to resist individuals or small groups. Against thousands, the lighthouse was not a fortress. It was a decorative obstacle. Wes must have read the collapse in my expression because he said, "The tower isn't the asset. The terrain is. This headland has a single access point, the road. The ground on either side is granite and loose scree. It's not impassable, but it's slow going, and the infected struggle with uneven terrain. Their motor function degrades on any surface that requires adaptive balance. We can channel them." He proposed a defense in depth, an outer perimeter of obstacles and noise diversion on the road a quarter-mile out, designed not to stop the advance but to split it, directing portions of the cluster off the road and onto the rocks, where their movement would slow to a crawl. A secondary line of physical barriers at the base of the headland, overturned vehicles, felled trees, anything massive enough to create a bottleneck, and a final position at the lighthouse itself, with the reinforced cottage as the main defensive line and the tower as the fallback. "This isn't about winning," Wes said. "This is about making this position expensive enough that the cluster flows around it instead of through it. Water follows the path of least resistance. So do they." I looked at the map, at the thin road leading to our thin point of land, and I began to understand that survival was not a state. It was an engineering problem with a constantly shifting solution. The next 4 days were the most physically demanding of my life, and I had spent months renovating a lighthouse by hand. Wes organized us with an efficiency that felt impersonal, until I recognized it as a form of care. He was preserving our energy by eliminating wasted effort. And every task he assigned was calibrated to the individual's capability. Dale and Garrett handled the outer perimeter. They drove Dale's truck down the access road and spent 2 days felling trees across it, creating a zigzag pattern that would force any approaching mass to redirect. Between the fallen trunks, they strung wire at knee height, not enough to stop the infected, but enough to tangle them, to create pileups that would slow momentum. At key points, Garrett rigged noise devices, battery-powered speakers connected to timers that would activate in sequence, drawing portions of the cluster away from the road and toward the shoreline cliffs. Nina established a communications post in the lantern room, expanding our shortwave capability with her own equipment. She monitored infected movement to the south and provided twice-daily updates on the approaching cluster's position. Her reports were clinical and precise, and left no space for optimism. The leading edge was moving faster than Wes had estimated. 3 days, not 5. Sarah appointed herself quartermaster without anyone assigning the role. She inventoried every consumable in the lighthouse and created a rationing system that stretched our food supply to 21 days. She was ruthlessly practical about it. When Garrett complained that the portions were small, she told him he could supplement with seaweed from the rocks and showed him which varieties were edible. He stopped complaining. Paul Marsh proved unexpectedly valuable. As a pharmacist, he understood chemistry, and Wes needed chemistry. Together, they constructed improvised deterrents from the cleaning supplies and renovation chemicals I had stored in the cottage. I won't describe the specifics. What I will say is that Paul's hands shook while he worked, and he paused every few minutes to close his eyes and breathe in a pattern that suggested practiced anxiety management. Whatever he had seen in Harker's Bluff had rewired his nervous system, but it had not erased his competence. Dina worked beside Margot, preparing the interior of the lighthouse for potential siege conditions. They filled every available container with water. They organized medical supplies. They created a go bag for each person containing 3 days of food, water purification tablets, and basic survival tools in case evacuation became necessary. Dina moved with the brisk determination of someone who had processed her fear into action items and was working through them sequentially. I spent those days doing what I had always done, building. Wes and I designed the secondary barrier together, and the collaboration revealed to me how much I had been missing by working alone. He thought in vectors and threat assessments. I thought in materials and load capacities. Together, we created a barrier system at the base of the headland that used the terrain's natural features rather than fighting them. We positioned granite boulders as anchors and connected them with cable and lumber to create a wall that was ugly and asymmetric and structurally resilient in ways a clean design would not have been. Theo helped. He appeared each morning at whatever work site I occupied and waited silently until I gave him a task. He carried tools. He held measurements. He sorted bolts by size with a methodical attention that suggested engineering might live in him the way it lived in me. As an organizing principle for a world that resisted organization, he still did not speak. But on the second day, he tugged my sleeve and pointed to a junction where 2 support beams met at an angle that created a stress concentration point. I looked at it. He was right. I redesigned the joint, and he watched with what I interpreted as satisfaction. That evening, I told Margot about his observation. She cried, but differently from how she had cried before. There was recognition in it. Her son was still in there, behind the silence. He was processing the apocalypse through spatial relationships and structural integrity. It was not language, but it was communication. The leading edge arrived at dusk on the 4th day, 12 hours ahead of Nina's final estimate. I was in the lantern room when I saw them. A dark line on the road to the south, visible against the pale gravel surface, moving with the tidal inevitability of something that did not need to rest or choose or doubt. There were perhaps 200 in this advance group. Through the scope, I could see them clearly in the dying light. They moved in a loose formation that was neither random nor organized in any pattern I recognized. Some walked, some shuffled. A few moved with a lurching speed that suggested their motor control had reorganized around efficiency rather than grace. They wore the clothes they had died in, metaphorically died in, since their hearts still beat and their lungs still drew air. Office clothes, work uniforms, pajamas. A child's soccer jersey that I forced myself to look away from before the image could finish forming in my mind. They hit Garrett's first noise device, a speaker playing a recording of a running engine, and the effect was immediate. The formation split, approximately half diverted toward the sound, moving off the road and onto the rocky shoulder. The other half continued forward, struck the first felled tree, and began the process Wes had predicted, piling against the obstacle, climbing over each other, getting tangled in the knee-high wire, creating a mass that moved through the zigzag with agonizing slowness. "It's working," Garrett said from beside me, his voice carrying the fragile relief of someone watching a theory survive its first contact with reality. It worked for 40 minutes. Then the second noise device activated, and the infected who had diverted to the first sound began moving toward the second. But a subset did not follow. They stood at the cliff edge where the first speaker was still playing and exhibited behavior I had never seen described in Lynn's broadcasts. They examined the speaker. One of them picked it up, turned it over, set it down. Then they turned and walked back toward the road. They had learned. In 40 minutes, They had identified an artificial stimulus and dismissed it. Wes appeared in the lantern room. How long until they clear the barriers? At this rate, an hour, maybe less. He nodded. Nina, what's the main body's position? 14 miles south, moving steadily. They'll be here by morning. The first 200 were manageable. The barriers slowed them. The terrain channeled them. Most of them reached the headland's base and encountered our secondary wall and milled against it with a persistence that was horrifying, but not yet overwhelming. The wall held. Dale fired 3 times. Carefully placed shots at infected who had found gaps in the barrier and were attempting to climb the scree slope. Each shot dropped its target, and the sound sent ripples of agitation through the mass below. But they did not flee. They pressed closer. We lost the outer perimeter by midnight. The fallen trees were shoved aside by accumulated bodies pushing against them. The wire traps were buried under infected who had fallen and been walked over by those behind them. The road was clear, and a steady stream continued to arrive. At 3 a.m, by flashlight in the cottage, Wes gathered us and spoke directly. The secondary barrier will hold through the night, but when the main body arrives, it will not hold. We cannot defend this position against 12,000. What we can do is survive on this headland if we collapse to the tower and seal the base. Sarah said what I was thinking. You're saying we abandon the cottage. I'm saying we have a lighthouse with a steel door at its base, a spiral staircase too narrow for more than one body at a time, and enough supplies to last weeks if we pre-stage them tonight. The cottage is a luxury. The tower is the objective. I looked around at the faces in the room. Dale's settled grimness, Sarah's calculating focus, Margot holding Theo against her, Paul and Dina gripping each other's hands. Garrett's young face struggling to maintain the professional detachment Wes modeled so effortlessly. Nina already packing her equipment. I had built this place to house one man's reinvention. Now it would have to shelter 10 people against a tide of ruined humanity. The engineering had never been more personal or more consequential. Start moving supplies, I said. We have until dawn. We spent 5 hours carrying everything essential up the spiral staircase. The tower's interior was never designed for habitation. It was a vertical tube 38 inches in diameter at its narrowest, widening slightly at each of the 3 landings where the original keepers had stored equipment. We staged water and food on the first landing, medical supplies and weapons on the second, and kept the lantern room as our command post and sleeping quarters. It was a miserably confined space for 10 people. The lantern room was 12 feet in diameter, surrounded by the glass panels that gave us our panoramic view, but also made us visible to anything below. I hung blackout fabric, cut from the curtains in the cottage, over the seaward panels, and left only the landward side uncovered for observation. We would live in artificial twilight. By dawn, the secondary barrier was under pressure. I watched from above as the leading edge pushed against it, reinforced by hundreds more arriving through the night. The cable and lumber wall that Wes and I had built with such collaborative pride flexed and groaned. Individual infected pressed into gaps, and the physics of accumulated force began to tell. A support cable snapped at 7:15 in the morning with a sound like a guitar string breaking, and a section of the wall shifted inward. Cottage door is sealed and barricaded, Dale reported from below. Tower base door is ready to close on your order. Wes was scanning the road. The main body is visible, south horizon. I looked. The road, as far as I could see, was filled. Not a crowd in the human sense, not individuals navigating around each other with social awareness. A mass. A fluid density of bodies occupying every available surface of the road, the shoulders, the drainage ditches on either side. They moved with a unified pace that was faster than a walk and slower than a jog. And the sound of them, thousands of feet on gravel, the collective displacement of air. And beneath it all, if I listened with the part of my mind that recognized things before my ears processed them, that subsonic pulse Nina had played for us arrived as a physical sensation, a vibration in the glass and the iron and the stone beneath my feet. "Close the tower," I said. Dale and Garrett pulled the cottage door shut and dropped the bar. Then they climbed the stairs, and we sealed the tower base door. 3 inches of steel that I had installed as a renovation feature, originally intended to preserve the tower's historical character by separating it from the modernized cottage. Its aesthetic purpose was now irrelevant. Its structural purpose was everything. We were sealed in. 10 people in a vertical tube of iron and brick, with the Atlantic at our back and 12,000 infected approaching our position. The secondary barrier failed at 8:40 in the morning. I watched it come apart from above. A section of cable pulling free from its granite anchor, the lumber wall folding inward, bodies pouring through the gap like water through a broken dam. They flooded across the headland, surrounded the cottage, and began pressing against its walls with the patient, distributed force of a rising tide. The cottage held. My reinforcements, the steel sheeting, the concrete board, the cross-braced barricade, did what they were designed to do. The infected could not break through. But they did not leave. They surrounded the structure completely, pressing against it from all sides, and the sound of their bodies against the walls was a continuous, shifting pressure that transmitted through the stone foundation and up through the tower's iron frame and into our bones. Margot had her hands over Theo's ears. Sarah sat with her back against the lantern room wall, eyes closed, breathing with deliberate control. Paul was having a panic attack that Dina managed with quiet, practiced competence. Her hands on his shoulders, her voice a steady murmur beneath the surrounding noise. Nina reported that the subsonic frequency had intensified. The clusters were communicating. They knew we were here. Not intellectually, they didn't understand the concept of people hiding in a tower. But they sensed our thermal signatures, heard our heartbeats perhaps. And the sum of those biological signals drew them the way a current draws water. We were the warmest thing on the headland, and they had found us. The siege compressed time into a substance I no longer recognized. Hours passed with the weight of days. The infected surrounded the lighthouse in a density that eliminated any view of the ground from the lantern room. Looking straight down, I saw only the tops of heads, shoulders, the ceaseless micro-movements of bodies pressed together without social awareness. They did not fight each other. They did not compete for position. They existed in a state of collective occupation that had no human analog I could reference. On the second day of containment, we discovered the water situation was worse than calculated. 2 of the containers we had staged on the first landing had cracked during transport, losing roughly a third of our water supply. Sarah revised the rationing. Each person received 1 cup in the morning, 1 at midday, 1 at night. It was not enough. It was what we had. The psychological pressure was worse than the physical deprivation. 10 people in a 12-foot circle, unable to move freely, unable to speak above a whisper for fear of intensifying the response below, unable to escape each other's proximity or their own mounting desperation. Tensions that had been managed by space and activity now had nowhere to discharge. Garrett was the first to fracture. On the second evening, he stood abruptly and announced that he was going to open the base door and fight his way to Dale's truck. The statement was so disconnected from tactical reality that it functioned as a diagnostic. Wes took his arm, sat him down, and spoke to him for 10 minutes in a voice too low for the rest of us to hear. Whatever he said, Garrett nodded, wiped his eyes, and went to sleep. But the incident exposed the thinness of our collective composure. Dale handled confinement the way he handled everything, with the stoic endurance of a man who had spent decades on the North Atlantic in small boats. He occupied himself by maintaining the weapons, cleaning and re-cleaning the rifle with meditative precision. He ate his rations without comment. He slept in efficient 4-hour blocks. If he was afraid, he stored it in a compartment I could not see, and I envied him for the architecture of that concealment. Sarah and I developed an unexpected rapport during those compressed days. She had the kind of intelligence that works best under constraint. When options narrow, her thinking sharpened rather than scattered. We sat by the landward window during the small hours of the third night and talked in whispers about subjects that had nothing to do with survival. She told me about the bookshop, about the pleasure of hand-selling a novel to someone who had walked in looking for something they couldn't name. I told her about drainage systems, about the hidden elegance of directing water through a city without anyone noticing. She said that was what good bookselling was too. Directing the right story to the right person without them realizing they'd been guided. It was the most intimate conversation I'd had since Renee left. Not because of its content, but because of its context. Intimacy, I realized, is not vulnerability shared in comfort. It is normalcy maintained under siege. On the third morning, something changed below. The sound shifted. The constant pressure against the cottage walls, which had become a white noise our nervous systems had reluctantly adapted to, developed a rhythm, not the random fluctuation of a crowd, but a pattern. Push, release, push, release. Synchronized across what sounded like hundreds of bodies simultaneously. Nina confirmed it. She held up her frequency monitor and showed me the waveform. The subsonic pulse had organized into a regular beat, and the physical pressure against the structure was synchronizing with it. They were coordinating, not thinking, not in any way I could call cognition, but responding to a shared signal that organized their individual movements into collective force. "They're going to bring down the cottage wall," Wes said. It was not speculation. It was engineering assessment from a man who understood structural failure the way I understood load-bearing specifications. He looked at me. How long? I calculated. The cottage walls were 18-inch stone, reinforced with steel on the interior, against distributed, rhythmic force from thousands of bodies acting in synchronization. 12 hours, maybe 18. Then we need a way out that doesn't go through the front door. The solution came from Theo. He had been sitting near the seaward window, one of the panels I had covered with blackout fabric. At some point during the third day, he had pulled the fabric aside and was looking down at the rocks below. I noticed and went to cover the window again, but he held the fabric back and pointed down at the rocks, at the cove where I had fished each morning. The seaward face of the headland was a near vertical granite cliff dropping 40 feet to the rocks and water below. The infected mass was concentrated on the landward side, where the road and accessible terrain led to the lighthouse. The seaward side, visible from the lantern room, was empty. The cliff face was too steep, too exposed, too far from the road that had funneled them here. Theo looked at me with those enormous eyes, and I understood what he was proposing before any adult in the room had considered it. The 7-year-old, who hadn't spoken in weeks, was telling me the exit was behind us. It had always been behind us. We had been so focused on the threat coming from the land that we had forgotten we were standing at the edge of the sea. I shared the observation with Wes and Sarah. Wes immediately saw the tactical potential. If we could descend the cliff to the cove, we could access the water. Dale's skiff, a 16-foot aluminum boat he used for inshore fishing, was pulled up on the rocks in that cove, where we had left it when the siege began. It wouldn't hold 10 people. It would hold 5, maybe 6 in an emergency. But the ocean was open, and the infected had shown no capacity for swimming or water navigation. The obstacle was the descent. 40 feet of granite cliff, much of it near vertical, with the only established path, the narrow trail I had used for fishing, entering the cliff face from the headland's surface, which was occupied by thousands of infected. "We go straight down from the tower," I said. The words arrived before the plan was fully formed, but my engineer's mind was already sketching it. The lantern room's seaward windows could be opened. They were hinged for ventilation, an original feature of the 1891 design. From the window ledge, a rope descent to the rocks below was feasible. Not safe, not comfortable, but geometrically possible. We had rope, 60 feet of climbing-grade nylon that Dale had brought among his supplies, intended originally for securing cargo. I had steel carabiners in my renovation kit. I had harness webbing that could be improvised into a rappelling rig. The cliff face had natural features, ledges, crevices, protrusions, that would serve as intermediate stations. The question was not whether we could do it. The question was whether we could do it with a 7-year-old, a pregnant woman, and a pharmacist whose hands shook when he wasn't medicated. The answer was that we had to, because in 12 to 18 hours, the cottage wall would fail, the infected would pour into the structure, and the pressure would transfer to the tower base door, which was strong but not infinite. We began preparations immediately. Wes and Garrett would descend first to secure the route and prepare the skiff. Dale and Nina would manage the rope from above. Sarah, Margot, and Theo would descend next, followed by Paul and Dina. I would go last. Wes objected to this order. If something goes wrong, the last person down has no backup. The last person down is the one who knows this tower's structural specifications well enough to judge the exact moment to leave. That's me. He studied my face for a moment, then nodded. Military culture, I realized, respected a certain kind of stubbornness when it was grounded in competence rather than ego. We waited for darkness. The infected responded to thermal signatures and sound, but their visual acuity, based on everything we had observed, was degraded. Night would not make us invisible, but it would reduce our profile against the cliff face. Margot held Theo and whispered to him the first words I had heard her speak directly about what was happening. "We're going to climb down to the water. You're going to be brave, and I'm going to be right behind you." Theo nodded. He had already known. At 11:15 that night, Wes opened the seaward window of the lantern room, and the Atlantic wind entered like a living thing, cold and saline, and carrying the sound of waves against the rocks below. For 3 days, we had breathed recycled air tinged with the collective biology of 10 frightened bodies. The ocean air felt like a substance from another epoch. Wes went first. He threaded the rope through a carabiner anchored to the lantern room's iron railing. Original 1891 hardware, cast iron, load-rated for the Fresnel lens maintenance equipment that had once been hauled through these windows. I had inspected those railings during renovation. They were overbuilt by a factor of 3, because the engineers of the 19th century understood that the cost of failure at the top of a lighthouse was absolute. For the first time, I felt genuine gratitude toward anonymous craftsmen who had been dead for a century. Wes lowered himself over the ledge and descended with the controlled fluidity of someone who had done this professionally. He reached the rocks in 4 minutes. His flashlight blinked twice, the all-clear signal. Garrett followed. His descent was less polished, but competent. 2 blinks. From the landward side of the tower, the sounds of the siege continued unchanged. The rhythmic pushing against the cottage wall had intensified. Through the floor, I could feel vibrations that hadn't been present that morning. The stone was transmitting stress. The wall would fail sooner than my 18-hour estimate. I had been conservative in my calculation, and the infected's coordination had continued to improve. Sarah descended next. She gripped the rope with a bookshop owner's hands, strong from years of shelving and receiving shipments, surprising in their capability. She made it down with only one pause, a moment at the 20-foot mark where the cliff face offered no foothold. And she swung free, pendulum-like, before finding a ledge with her right foot and continuing. Then Margot. This was the descent I feared most. She was 5 months pregnant, her center of gravity shifted, her grip strength diminished by weeks of stress and insufficient nutrition. Wes had rigged a secondary safety line, and Garrett belayed from below. She descended slowly, deliberately, each movement calculated with the protective precision of someone carrying more than her own weight. Halfway down, her foot slipped and she dropped 18 inches before the belay caught. The sound she made was not a scream, but a compressed exhalation that contained an entire scream folded into silence. She continued. She reached the rocks. She sat down and did not stand for several minutes. Theo descended alone. This was his decision. When Margot had suggested tying him to her for a tandem descent, he had pulled away, the most assertive physical response anyone had seen from him. He wanted to climb by himself. Wes tied a harness around his small body, rigged double safety lines, and talked him down from below with a voice that carried up the cliff face like a rope made of sound. Theo's descent was the most technically proficient of any of us. He found every foothold. He managed the rope with intuitive understanding. He moved down the granite face the way I moved through structural calculations, with a fluency that bypassed conscious analysis. He was, I understood in that moment, something extraordinary. Whatever the silence had cost him, it had also given him a relationship with physical space that transcended verbal cognition. Paul and Dina descended together. Dina first, Paul following with his shaking hands gripping the rope so tightly that he left blood on the nylon from burst blisters. Nina went next, carrying her shortwave equipment in a pack that made her descent lopsided but manageable. Dale paused at the window and looked back at the interior of the tower. He had spent 10 days in this lighthouse. I had spent months. But in his pause, I saw the same thing I felt. The recognition that this structure had held us together through something that should have scattered us, and that leaving it was a small death, a farewell to the only solid ground we had known since the world changed. "Your turn," he said, and began his descent. I was alone in the lantern room. I stood in the 12-foot circle of the lantern room and listened to the lighthouse die. The sound from below had changed. The rhythmic pushing had accelerated, and beneath it, a structural groan was building. The harmonic of stone reaching its failure point. The cottage wall was minutes from breach, not hours. My conservative estimate had been wrong because I had modeled the infected as a constant force. And they were not constant. They were adaptive. The synchronization had tightened, the force had increased, and the wall was giving way. I moved to the window. The rope hung against the cliff face, pale against dark granite, swaying slightly in the wind. Below, 9 flashlight beams moved among the rocks as the group prepared the skiff. I could hear Wes's voice, stripped of its content by the wind, but carrying authority through cadence alone. They were ready. I put one leg over the window ledge and paused. The lighthouse stood around me, its iron bones humming with the transferred violence below. The Fresnel lens, cracked and clouded, caught the moonlight and fractured it into prismatic fragments that played across the walls. This tower had guided ships for 96 years. It had stood through hurricanes and neglect and decades of abandonment. I had come to it broken, looking for a project to replace a marriage. And it had given me something I hadn't expected, a reason to build that extended beyond myself. From below, the sound of stone giving way, a deep percussive crack that resonated up through the tower's frame. The cottage wall had failed. I heard the rush of bodies entering the structure, not footsteps, but a wave sound, a mass displacement of air and matter that filled the cottage beneath me. Then the impact against the tower base door began. Metal rang against metal as bodies struck it. The vibrations traveled up the staircase I had reinforced, through the landings where our supplies still sat, up to the lantern room where I remained. I descended. The rope burned against my palms despite the gloves. I moved with the desperate efficiency of someone who has calculated the margin and found it measured in seconds rather than minutes. The cliff face was cold and alien beneath my feet. Granite that had existed for millions of years and would exist for millions more, indifferent to the biological catastrophe playing out on its surface. I was irrelevant to this rock. We all were. The infected, the uninfected, the lighthouse, the civilization that had built and abandoned it. All of it was temporary notation on a geological surface that recognized no categories of significance. I reached the rocks. Hands grabbed me, Garrett and Dale, pulling me toward the cove where the skiff was already in the water. The group was aboard, crowded beyond safety but within survival. I pushed through the shallow water, feeling the Atlantic seize my legs with cold, and hauled myself over the gunwale. Dale started the outboard motor. It caught on the second pull, a sound so mechanically normal that it felt like a message from the world before. We motored out of the cove or around the headland's southern point and into open water. From the ocean, I could see the lighthouse, white against the dark sky, and around it the mass of infected that covered the headland like a secondary geology. They pressed against the tower. They surrounded the cottage's broken walls. They covered the road and the rocks and every surface that would hold a human body. As we pulled away, I saw a group of them reach the cliff edge. They stood there, looking out at the water, or not looking, since looking implies comprehension, orienting, tracking the thermal signature of 10 living bodies moving across a cold ocean surface. They did not follow. The water was a boundary they could not cross. For now. Nina's radio crackled, Lynn's voice steady as ever, reading updated coordinates for relay stations along the coast. Safe harbors, other survivors, other lighthouses perhaps, where other engineers and bookshop owners and silent children had built what they could against the dark. We motored north, the lighthouse shrinking behind us, its form becoming abstract, then symbolic, then invisible against the coast. I did not look back after it disappeared. There was nothing behind us that would improve by being watched. We found refuge on an island 11 miles offshore, a granite shelf with a decommissioned Coast Guard station that someone had already begun fortifying. There were 30 people there when we arrived. There are 52 now. We are building something. I hesitate to call it a community because the word implies a permanence I no longer trust, but it functions as one. People eat together. People argue. People make plans that assume a future. Theo spoke his first words 6 days after we landed. He was helping me reinforce a door frame, holding a bracket while I drilled. And when I finished, he said, "Good." One syllable. Margot collapsed against the wall behind him. Sarah put her arm around her. Dale, passing by, nodded once, which was his version of weeping. I build things now. That's what I do. I build walls and water systems and shelters and whatever else is needed. The engineering is the same as it always was. Calculating loads, managing stress, directing forces. The difference is that I understand now what it's for. I never built the lighthouse for myself. I just didn't know who I was building it for until they arrived. The light is gone, but the keeper remains.